Hi, welcome everyone. Nice to see you. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Village Bookshop. I'm Noni Brennan and I'm one of the bookshop owners. On behalf of myself and my partners, Mike, Lorian, Gail, Doug, and Barbara, I'd like to welcome you to our first author event. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Bryn Turnbull, the best-selling author of her new novel, The Woman Before Wallis. Welcome, Bryn.
Hi,
So glad that you're here.
thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to be with your gorgeous bookshop.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Noni mentioned, my name is Bryn Turnbull. I'm a Toronto born and raised author. My background is actually in communications, but I always wanted to write a book, but it was always something that I thought I'd do much later in life until I found the woman who ultimately became the woman before Wallis, Thelma Morgan Furness. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really excited to share a little bit of the book with you and sort of some of the bits that went into it.
And so, Bryn, we talked about you starting off with with doing the reading around Wallis being asked to take care of David. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you a little bit of a précis for anybody who hasn't read the book, The Woman Before Wallis tells the true story of Thelma Morgan Furness, who was mistress to the Prince of Wales in the 1930s, before he met and advocated the throne for Wallis Simpson. Now everybody knows the story of Wallis and Edward because it is considered one of the greatest love stories of all time. What people don't know is that Thelma was the reason Edward and Wallis got together. In 1934, Thelma had to leave Edward for a period of about 6 weeks. And before she left, she took her best friend Wallis to the Ritz Hotel in London and told her, Edward's going to be very lonely without me. Will you look after him while I'm gone? And when she came back 6 weeks later, it turned out that Wallis had done a bit too good of a job looking after Edward. So I'm going to read that scene from the book for you just right now. They had met at the Ritz Hotel. She couldn't count the number of times she'd come here on David's arm to dance in the ballroom or dine in a private suite with one of his brothers. Yesterday, it had been just her and Wallis at a quiet table in the back of the Winter Garden. Given the chilly mist that had settled over London, the restaurant was near to full, diners in cream-colored chairs seeking refuge from the fog. The room was dominated by a Baroque fountain, its gilt glamour reflected in the gold scrollwork that ran along the walls and the ceiling. You seem distracted today, Thelma. Is it nerves? I always go a little queer before traveling, the effort of it all, said Wallis, handing the menu back to the attending waiter. In her typical fashion, Wallis was the best-dressed woman in the room. She wore a butter yellow afternoon dress, expertly tailored to her slim figure, its high neckline accentuated by an amber and gold brooch nestled in the hollow of her throat. Her hair was pinned into immaculate curls, which, along with her burgundy lips, drew attention away from her square jaw. Seated next to a marble column, Wallis looked at home, her own modest charm magnified by the striking beauty of the room around her. Thelma pulled a cigarette case and lighter from her handbag. I don't know, she said. I hate to leave David. He can get so melancholy. Wallis lifted her teacup, dismissing Thelma's concerns with the sweep of her hand. He's a man. They don't stay blue for long. We'll allow him one afternoon to moon over you before finding some suitable distraction. That's my concern, said Thelma. I don't mind distractions so long as they don't become permanent. I'll be gone such a long time. What if someone turns his head? Wallis looked at Thelma, frowning. I can't pretend it's not a possibility, she said. He will be awfully lonely without you. Thelma positioned the lighter so the flame caught the end of her cigarette, her heart sinking. Well, she said, feigning a confidence she didn't truly feel. Nothing to be done for it now, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'll have to rely on you to look after him for me while I'm gone. There was a moment in which Thelma worried she'd said the wrong thing, but then Wallis smiled. Of course, she said, setting her cup back in its saucer. She reached a hand across the table and patted Thelma's arm. You can count on me. Now, before I forget, would you mind picking up a few odds and ends for me while you're in New York? Some things are so difficult to find here.
Thank you. That was great. So, Bryn, this is your first novel, and it's a bestseller. Do you want to pinch yourself?
Yeah, I really do. It's so beyond what I expected for this book to achieve. Anytime I think you start a creative project in general, you start it on the assumption that you're the only one who's going to see it. And I think that's why art is such a passion. It's such a passion just in and of itself, because you're doing it for yourself. So when I started this, no, I did not think it would blow up the way that it has. I think I've got a number of different sort of entities to thank for that, one of which being Downton Abbey, of course, which ignited quite a lot of interest in the time period that I'm writing about. And then, of course, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And they actually weren't even dating when I started writing the book. And to see everything that's happened with them and to see the parallels that people are drawing between Harry and Meghan and Wallis and Edward, I think that it's really, I've been very lucky in the cultural moment where this book has been published.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about where you got the inspiration for this novel.
So I actually have Madonna to thank for this book. I'm not even kidding. In 2011, she directed a movie called W.E., and it is about Wallis and Edward's courtship and their relationship in the abdication. And in that movie, she referenced the moment where Thelma asks Wallis to take care of the prince while she's traveling. And I remember I was watching the movie, I was sitting at home, and I kind of sat up at that moment thinking, what an odd request for somebody to make, even of a trusted friend. That is a very strange thing to ask. And in my mind, it was she asking it because she genuinely thought that this was someone she could trust? Or was she asking it because she was tired of Edward, who, as we all know, was a rather weak king and a weak man? So I started going through the research process thinking maybe she had kind of said to herself, I'm sick of him. Wallis is interested. I'm going to leave the barn doors open. And if the horse gets out, the horse gets out. That was honestly what I thought when I started writing the book, was that was going to be the story that I'd be writing. And obviously, for people who've reached the end of the book, you can tell that very much wasn't the case. So yeah, Madonna, thanks.
So in reading the book, it is so obvious that you did a tremendous amount of research. Can you talk to us a little bit about the research and how you dove into it and what you learned?
Yeah, well, one of the great things about this particular time period and this particular social set is the fact that there's so much documented about them. Edward and Wallis in particular, we have all of the letters that they wrote to each other. We've got basically every day of Edward's life in different books, in different autobiographies, different biographies. But Thelma and Gloria also wrote an autobiography, the two of them, which I used as kind of the foundational text for the book. So that's where I started, was going through all of these autobiographies, going through secondary sources and looking at these individuals and the choices they made, building out my timeline and figuring out what the seminal events were in Thelma's life, namely the abdication and the Vanderbilt trial, and kind of going through and figuring all that out. But when I kind of came to the conclusion that this was something I wanted to do, this was a book I was going to write, I decided, I was working full time when I started, and I realized I was spending more time thinking about the book than I was thinking about my paid job. So I decided to go back to school, do a master's in creative writing, and give myself a year to really focus on it and see if this was something that I could accomplish. And when I decided that, I chose to go to school in the UK, knowing that was where the book was going to be set. So as a result of that year spent abroad, I was able to visit a lot of the places that were important to Thelma. I was able to walk her neighborhoods in London. I was able to go up to Glen Affric, not the house itself, but the surrounding lands, and really just get a sense, dig into who she was and the life that she lived. And also culturally, what that upper crust British culture, the difference between that and me, this, very casual colonial. So that was, that finding that distinction was very interesting. And then also, I'm a very 5 sense person. I'm very tactile. So I was able to go to a number of museums, find clothing from the time period. I'm a absolute lover of fashion, so being able to go and see the dresses, see in Thelma's autobiography, she actually will mention exactly the dress that she wore to a particular event. So I was able to look up the actual dresses that she wore in quite a number of cases. And so kind of pulling all of that together was just such a treat. I did 2 years of research and 2 years of writing for this book, and I quite happily could have done a whole other year of research.
That's incredible. One of the things that I loved and found so interesting in the book was the intersection and dynamics of the families that this book is centered around. So you've got the Windsors, you've got the Vanderbilts, you've got the Morgans, you've got the Furnaces. Can you talk a little bit about sort of these familial relationships and how you delved into the families that you were writing about?
Well, I mean, there's that old saying, you can't choose your family. And I think in Thelma's case, that is a very apt expression, given her relationship with her mother. But then we also see, all these different dynamics playing out between the Windsors, between the Vanderbilts, and between the Morgans. The Windsors and the Vanderbilts, really, they kind of constitute royalty on both sides of the Atlantic. And Thelma and her family are caught in the middle of these sort of highest echelons of society. And that puts them in a very odd place. And I think that put Gloria and Thelma in a much more intense relationship between the two of them, trying to navigate these circles that they weren't kind of born to, if I may call it that. Family in this book, I think royalty in and of itself is so interesting to me, because we see all of these familial dynamics play out again and again and again in the same families. I mentioned Harry and Meghan, but we'll see all of these different storylines, you could almost call them, play out. And because we have such long lineages for the royal family, and fairly for the Vanderbilts as well, you're able to see those through lines, I suppose. And so that to me was very interesting, looking at the royal family then, looking at the royal family now, looking at sort of the reverberations of the decisions that these people made, which you can see today. I mean, if Edward hadn't abdicated, we wouldn't have Queen Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. And, we're very much dealing with the fallout of his decision.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to remind everybody to please type your questions into chat, because I'm looking to start receiving your questions so that we can make sure we have an opportunity to ask Bryn everything we want to know about this book. Bryn, you mentioned Thelma and Gloria. I think one of the things that was very intriguing was the depth of their relationship. Can you talk a little bit about their relationship, what you learned about it through your research, and how you embraced that and wrote about it in the novel?
So when I started writing the book, I honestly thought it was going to be a royal romance. I thought it was going to be about Thelma and Edward. And as I got into the research, it became very clear to me that the more interesting relationship in Thelma's life, and the stronger relationship in Thelma's life, was that with her sister Gloria. And they were twins. They were identical twins. And in their autobiography, which again, they wrote together, they wrote they alternated chapters. They talk about the intensity of the connection that they had, where, at one point, and, twins, I've heard this from other twins. I've got twins in my family, a couple sets of twins. And, they'll talk about when one twin hurts their leg, the other twin occasionally will feel a twinge of it. So things like that really surprised me, that the depth of that connection. I almost thought that Thelma and Gloria were making that up. When I went through it, I was like, oh, they're just being melodramatic. And then I spoke to my twin cousins, who are 20-year-old boys, about it. And they said, yeah, no, that's a thing. Very much a thing. I'm also very lucky to have a very close relationship with my sister, Haley, who's a couple years younger than me. But I was able to build that I was able to build that bond into the way that Thelma and Gloria interact. And then finally, you know, Gloria, just like, what a tragic figure, what a tragic life she had. And it meant so much to me that Thelma stood by her. It meant so much to me that the choices Thelma made were ones to support her sister, particularly a sister who in the 1930s was bisexual. And in a world where that was not, not seen as proper, for Thelma to stand by her sister, I think that showed a real mark of integrity and a real mark of her character. And that absolutely spoke to me.
And one of the things that you mentioned was the fact that David was weak. And in reading the novel, I really saw him as a flawed human. He really comes across as being very immature. Can you tell us what you were thinking about when you were sort of channeling him, and how you sort of embraced who you saw him as, and how that has come across in the novel?
God, you know, he was such a tricky character to write, because I think when you're writing historical fiction about real people, and particularly very prominent people, everybody who reads the book has a conception of who that person was. And, you know, nowhere do we see that more than with Wallis and Edward. Everybody has an opinion on Wallis and Edward and who they were. And there's so much out there on him. So when I started this book, one of the reasons that I thought it was going to be a story of a woman who was trying to get a troublesome guy off of her hands is because I had a preconceived notion of Edward and who he was. And the fact that he was weak, the fact that he was a fascist sympathizer, the fact that he gave up his throne for really quite selfish reasons, all of that fed into how I was approaching his character. And I found it very difficult to write him. I found that a very difficult thing to kind of get my head around, until I came to the realization that I can't look at Edward from my perspective. I can't look at him through my eyes, knowing what I know about him historically. I have to look at him from the perspective of a woman who genuinely was in love with him. And that was the switch that I kind of had to take in order to write what I felt was a more authentic portrayal of him. Now, that portrayal, coming to that, like, how do I find that love for him? How do I find that love that Thelma genuinely felt for this man? And for me, it lay in his vulnerability. He was one of the strongest men in the world, most powerful men in the world. And yet he had this like very heartbreaking wistfulness to his face. He was very slim, very small, and he had this vulnerability, this intense vulnerability. And I think that was what spoke to Thelma more than anything else. It was, here's the most powerful man in the world, but I'm the one who can care for him. I'm the one who can make him smile. I'm the one who can kind of smooth that worry away from his face. And so coming to that realization, coming to that understanding of him, made him a character that I could not exactly like, but a character that I could understand.
One of the things that you mentioned a little bit when you were mentioning the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was about how women are, what happens and how people are seen, and how that evolves. But at the time that this book takes place, the options for women were limited, and history does not often remember these women well. We see that same thing happening with the Duchess of Sussex today. But your study of these women provides more depth into who they were as people, and the challenges that they faced in their lives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, all through history, women are remembered, kind of with one word answers, right? It's Wallis Simpson was a shrew. Gloria Vanderbilt was an unfit mother. The Duchess of Sussex is a scheming American. And so often women get reduced to negative labels without an understanding of who they actually were as individuals. And my title actually is a nod to that. Thelma, in the historical record, despite the fact that she had this vibrant life, despite the fact that she was at the center of two of the most seminal events of the 1930s, all she's remembered as is the woman before Wallis, quite literally. And so kind of playing with those ideas of womanhood and how women have been reduced through history, it was important to me to be able to kind of dig into Thelma and dig into these women as women, not as archetypes, not as, you know, the Madonna or the whore. It's digging into them as actual human individuals. So that really is kind of where that comes down to. And like I said, we're seeing it now. I don't think that we've actually progressed all that far from Thelma's time, where it was, this is what you...
I think Bryn has frozen. In my mind, I was just thinking, this is going well, and then all of a sudden, Bryn froze. So
give her a second.
Let's give her a second and see what happens. Hopefully, she'll be back.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Oh, there you are.
I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on.
No, you just froze, but that's okay. You're back.
Okay.
I think we got the gist.
Yeah, I think we got the gist of that. But I'm getting some questions from our audience here. So I'm going to start with a question from Joanne Levy, and Joanne is a local author. Joanne, do you want to ask the question yourself? You can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. There you go. Go ahead, Joanne.
Here I am. And I didn't brush my hair today, so I'm not going on video because I'm not the author on display. So the question I put into the chat was, did you ever struggle, and this is going to be obvious that it's from an author, did you ever struggle with wanting to fictionalize part of the story, either for readability or because you felt it would make for a more interesting storyline, but felt you had to really stick with the true story as we all know it?
That's a really great question. To me, like, okay, when I started writing the book, I'm going to be absolutely true to the historical record 100% of the time. If it was raining on this day in history, I'm going to write about the fact that it was raining on that day in history. And I initially had structured the book as fully, like, day by day. It was going to be a very linear storyline. And I remember taking it to an author friend of mine, and he said, if you're going to write it that way, why aren't you just writing it as a nonfiction biography? Like, why, you need to have a structure to it. There needs to be something more dynamic, and you need to be able to pull the reader along the plot line, not just along the facts of Thelma's life. And so that, to me, kind of gave me a little bit more permission to be a little bit flexible with the facts of the story. That said, I am very true to the facts. The only thing I've changed, I condensed the time between the trial and the end of Thelma's relationship. I condensed the two of those together by a period of about 3 months, and I explained that in my author's note. That was for the purpose of the plot and for making the book a bit more dynamic. But again, everything that happened in the book actually did happen. The only thing that I'm really fictionalizing are the conversations.
Thank you. And we've got a question here from Tina. Tina, do you want to unmute and go ahead and ask the question?
Okay, I'm gonna.
She's got two speakers on.
Yeah,
Why don't you do Tina's question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. There's too much echo, Noni.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to read your question. So, Bryn, please comment on whether you feel the events in the women's lives that impacted them were the result of decisions made by men, or do you feel that these women, being so strong and surrounded by other women, had control over what happened in their lives?
Oh my God, no one's ever asked me that before. That is a great question. So for me, this time period was very much, and I mentioned this earlier, it's a time period where women's options were limited. And 9 times out of 10 in this particular echelon of society, your choices were limited by the men that you surrounded yourselves with. And that's, like that is so much a part of why Thelma marries money, as her mother tells her to do, because that is, in their context, that's the only way to get ahead in the world. But Thelma was so interesting to me because she turned that notion completely on its head. If she had just been, making decisions based, or, rather, if men had been making the decisions in her life, if her life had been driven by the men in her life, I don't think that she would have had an affair with the Prince of Wales. I think she would have just stayed with Duke and said, this is the relationship that I've got. He's going to cheat on me, and that's just going to be what we do. Duke, being from an older generation, certainly expected that. He expected his wife to come back, or to stay at home by the fire knitting while he went to Monte Carlo with his latest paramour. And Thelma didn't do that. And I think part of that was because she was younger. Part of that was because she was American and hadn't been brought up in this, in this aristocratic system where divorce didn't happen. And so Thelma taking that power back for herself by having an affair, and not only having an affair, but having an affair with the most powerful man in the world, I think was such an interesting choice for her to make. Gloria, kind of the same thing. She rejects the system of, the surrogacy of her daughter's inheritance. She rejects that, and she kind of takes control for herself, or she tries to, and she gets, smacked down for it. And then, we come to Wallis, and Wallis is a bit of an interesting case. I think that she wanted very much to gain power within, the societal set that she was a part of, which is why she ended up going after Edward. But she certainly wasn't expecting him to abdicate the throne. She was not expecting him to propose marriage to her. And at the end of the day, she's really the only one who got completely bound up by the actions of the man in her life, which was David, or Edward rather.
And Wendy has a question. Wendy, would you like to ask the question yourself? Okay, I'm going to ask it for her.
Oh, I think I'm okay now. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Wendy. Go for it.
So, Bryn, thanks for being with us. It's fascinating. So what's next for you?
I am working on a second book right now. It is also historical fiction, and it's about the fall of the Romanov dynasty, told from the perspective of the eldest daughter, Olga. So that's coming out in, I think, March 2022.
And Carolyn Rose has a question. Carolyn, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Sure, I'll ask the question. Just wondered if you could talk about the process of the printing, of the publishing. I mean, you mentioned you did 2 years to research and 2 years to write. If you could just talk about the last part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Caroline, I love your picture. Like with the snow in the background. That's so great. It's so glamorous. So when I finished writing the book, I kind of got the manuscript to a point where I felt I'd kind of taken it as far as I could take it. And I started looking for an agent, knowing that it was going to be historical fiction, knowing that I wanted it to, I kind of looked at other historical fiction writers who I felt wrote similarly to me, not necessarily the same time period, but, the plotting was similar, the voice was similar. And I kind of looked up all of their agents, and I contacted them, and I ended up getting signed with my agent, Kevin, who's lovely. And from there, she and I did a manuscript cut. We cut probably about 40,000 words from the manuscript at that point, and she sent it out to a number of editors, including my editor at Mira, who picked it up. And once we picked it up, we went through another round of edits. We cut probably another 20,000 words, and tightened it up. And the thing is, you get to a point in the manuscript process where you really do realize, I need someone else's voice to impact it now. And for me, that was my agent and my editor. My editor helped me, she helped me deepen some of the secondary characters. She helped me deepen Gertrude as the secondary character. And then from there, we kind of finalized the manuscript. And then after that, it was cover. The cover was like the greatest process ever, because all it was me opening an email, seeing exactly this and going, yep, that's perfect. Don't change a thing. And then, the publication date got set, and I was kind of working up towards it on my, with my publicist and with the marketing team. And now it's out in the world.
Great. Richard Pierce has a question. Richard, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes,
Yep.
you are.
Okay, thank you, Bryn. Thank you, Noni, for this. My question was that one of the things in studying the periods between the culture and history between the First and Second World War, was coming out of the First World War was the liberation of women.
Mm-hmm.
And, much more so or earlier so than what we always take for granted as being a factor of the 60s. Do you feel that the lifestyles of Thelma, Gloria, and Wallis sort of are reflective of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of the interest in these characters was the fact that they weren't necessarily allowing men to define their decision making in the same way that women had done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, I do think that is a result of the First World War. Women finally being empowered to participate in society in a way that they hadn't done before, and as a result of that empowerment, being able to speak their minds more. That said, it was a baby step, not a grand leap. So they were still very much confined by the conventions of their day, if not more fully. There was something else. Oh shoot, there was something else I was going to say, and I think I've lost it. Darn. Well, about the culture between the wars. To me, this is such an interesting time period. The 1930s were fascinating because you've got the end of the First World War. You've got this explosion of life from people who had lived through the horrors of the First World War. All of these young, particularly in their 20s and 30s, who just wanted to live. They wanted to have a good time. It was the bright young things, the Great Gatsby, running around in, in a car without a top, just swigging champagne. And that stereotype was very much there at the highest echelons of society. That also contributed to a boom in art, culture, music, fashion. We get Art Deco. We get all of these incredible cultural movements that come out of the 1920s and 1930s before that curtain falls again with the start of the Second World War. So for me, being able to kind of dive into that cultural explosion was just such a privilege. It was so incredible.
Well, yes. If I just may add one comment, it certainly is what makes it so incredibly fascinating for me in your relating the lifestyles of them during that period, because I concur with you on that the period is one of the most fascinating in history between the two world wars.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Bryn, what was the value of your year in the UK in terms of what did it bring and how did it enrich your novel and add depth to your story?
I mean, it was absolutely invaluable to me in every single way. I would say, if anyone's looking to write and they're thinking about doing a creative writing program, do it, because it's just so interesting. It is interesting to get someone else's perspective on the craft of writing, which you may not necessarily have or bring to the table on your own. So for me, I mentioned in an earlier comment that when I started writing the book, it was linear. And I had started the book, I had about 180 pages written. And when I was in Scotland, I went to my thesis supervisor and he said, okay, tell me a little bit more about the book. And I said, well, it starts when Thelma and Gloria are 16, and then they're 17, and then they're 18, and then they're 19. And then that's the way the book's going to go. And he looked at me and he said, if you're going to write it that way, you should just write a nonfiction. You should just be writing a biography. Why are you bothering with a historical fiction? Where's the structure? And I said, John, the structure's right there. I told you the structure. they start at 16 and then it's 17 and then it's 18 and then it's 19. I don't see how there's not a structure. And he goes, that's not a structure. That is a timeline. You can't, you can write it, but it's not going to be compelling. It's just going to be the story of someone's life told start to finish. There's no pull there. And I left and I went, nah, he's wrong. Absolutely wrong. There's no. And I was living along the beach in, for anybody who's been to St. Andrews, I was living along East Sands Beach. So I'm walking home from the university, and it was sort of maybe like a half an hour walk. And I go, no, he's crazy. He's not right. But if he was, I suppose I would be looking at this event and this event. And if I were to turn them so that they, kind of mirrored each other, oh, interesting. And of course, by the time I got home, I realized he was absolutely right. And I needed to throw out all 180 pages that I'd written and start afresh. So from that perspective, he was the one who taught me about scaffolding, about plotting the book out in such a way that you can really dive in and fill in the spaces just much more genuinely. And so that was really important. I think that was a very important lesson for me on my writing process. And that's not something I would have found on my own if I didn't have someone that I could bounce it off of and who really supported me and encouraged me in the writing process. And then I'd also mentioned the cultural differences that, you find in the UK as opposed to here. And, you don't think that they're going to be all that big, but in a lot of respects they are. Like I was a mature student at one of the oldest universities in the world. And the undergrad students were so phenomenally wealthy and had no idea how wealthy they were. Like I remember getting invited to a champagne pong party. And I thought, this is so not anything you would find in Canada. And so that, that in and of itself was that sense of entitlement, which I was very surprised to find.
And Bryn, one of the things I'm wondering is this book autobiographical at all? Are you in there somewhere?
Oh yeah, no, I'm in there. I'm not telling you where.
One of the other things that I loved about this book was your descriptions and the study of the houses. So we've got Glen Affric, we've got Fort Belvedere, Borough Court, Arlington Place, York House, Thelma's Flat, Wallis's Flat. How did you envision these places? How did you see them? And was it easy for you to write about them?
So my favorite thing to write is setting. I love writing setting. And all of these houses, I like, there's a lot of research on them. York House in particular, Fort Belvedere, we've got YouTube videos, images, we've got pictures of Wallis Simpson's flat in Bryanston Court. And so from a research perspective, I could kind of get the visual cues of what I wanted. Thelma's house, particularly her apartment in Grosvenor Square, that was more a figment of my imagination. That was me thinking, okay, if I was a separated woman in the 1930s who had oodles of money, what would I want my house to look like? So that I kind of pulled out of thin air. But to me, those were the most interesting things to write. I kind of write, I call it writing like a camera, where, like a camera will swoop into a scene and it'll kind of span around the scene and then settle on the characters. And for me, that was an important thing to do because the 1930s is such a distinctive cultural touch point. And it's a touch point that people have preconceived notions about. People know Art Deco. They know, they know the designers of the time period. They know what they think a flat is going to look like in the 1930s. And so you've got to be able to hit that. You've got to be able to really kind of make a nod to what people's preconceived notions of something is already going to be, because it's going to be there. And then you kind of try and broaden it a little bit.
Who are the writers that you really admire and who has inspired you? And do you have any favorite writers?
Oh my gosh, yes. I have a lot of favorite writers. I would say Louis de Bernier, who wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I love the way that he writes. He's just a gorgeous writer, start to finish. Kate Quinn is another one who I adore. And I've actually become friends with her, which is like meeting my hero. I love it. And she wrote The Alice Network and The Huntress. And she's got a new one coming out, I think, next year called The Rose Code, about the Bletchley Park code breakers. And I love the way that she writes. I think she's incredible. Growing up, I definitely had an affinity for J.K. Rowling, mainly because of the world building that she did, like the detail that she puts into a completely fictional world, I think is astounding from the perspective of a historical fiction writer who is starting from a basis of knowledge. To be able to just pull something out of thin air completely is a skill that I just, I bow down to. And then finally, Neil Gaiman is a writer who I absolutely adore. He just writes, again, he writes beautifully. He writes so immersively that as a reader, you just get completely transported. And so that to me is like the magic power of writing, is if I can just completely forget myself, the author's done something right.
What's it like to walk into a bookshop and see a pile of your books in there?
I will never get over it. Honestly, I will never get over it. It's the coolest thing to be able to go in and see like your name on the shelf. And I think so much of that is because when you tell people I'm a writer, that can mean so many different things to so many different people. And most of being a writer is being alone in a room, working on your own, on something that people don't see. And for the longest time when I was writing this book, I'd go to, a cocktail party and people would say, what do you do? I say, I'm a writer. And their eyes would kind of glaze over. And it's because I had nothing to show for it. And I don't say that like, like I was insulted. And I certainly don't mean insult against anybody who writes and doesn't show it to anybody. But it was one of those, like, as a professional writer, until you actually produce something, people aren't going to take you seriously. And as a professional writer, because I did this full time for so long, I always got very self-conscious about the fact that I didn't have anything to show for it yet. I was like, no, it's going to come. It's going to be a real book. I promise. It's not just like, it's actually going to be a thing. And so for it to be on the shelves now, it's so cool. It's so cool. But I mean, to be honest, I would have been happy finishing a book anyway and leaving it in the desk drawer. I would have been happy with that. I truly would have, because the accomplishment is personal. But it's neat to be able to share it.
Yeah, that's great. And what's it like going out doing author events and meeting people who've read your book who want to talk about it? What's that experience like? It's
been lovely. I mean, it certainly isn't the book release I was expecting. I did not expect to be launching in the middle of a global pandemic. And I did not expect to not be meeting people in person. But I so love how bookstores have pivoted to be providing events online. And through that, I can still meet people. I can still, I can talk to readers. I can hear about what they liked about the book. And that's so important to me, to be able to talk to people and know that they loved it. It's great. It's so great.
And there was a comment on the chat from Catherine Tillman who said, it's one thing to describe the setting, but it's another to travel back through time and bug the conversations that were happening. So well done.
Thank you, Catherine.
Now you have another reading for us, and it's the People Like Us reading. Can you set this up a little bit and tell us about this part of the book and sort of what you were thinking and how you brought this to the book, and then do that reading for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a reading that comes quite near the end of the book, when it's right after Thelma realizes that Edward and the Windsors have sent a lawyer to, to basically keep the royal family's name out of the trial. And this lawyer has provided a list of he's provided incriminating evidence essentially to damn Gloria in the court case. And basically what this is it's kind of a meditation on the fact that these women were part of high society, but they were not of high society. And that was a distinction that they thought they didn't realize was there. I don't really know. Does that set it up? Kind of? Yeah. So I'm just going to read you this scene, and it's about it's about the entitlement of the upper classes and the entitlement that these people very much felt born to. And Thelma learns a very bitter lesson about the fact that only certain people are allowed this very high privilege. So it's July 1933, London. Of all the hotels in London, the Ritz was Thelma's favorite. It reminded her of Paris in its old world brilliance, yet to Thelma's mind, the Ritz London surpassed its French cousin in glamour. She loved it all, walking beneath the arcade entrance on Piccadilly with its marquee bright letters, passing an afternoon in the Buttergold tea room, overhearing conversations from other tables, new loves and old feuds forming and dissolving around her, watching couples pass arm in arm through the flower-laden lobby. Most of all, Thelma loved descending the marble staircase to the Ritz's subterranean ballroom. It was an entrance into another world, heralded by echoes of music that grew louder with each downward step, sound exploding into technicolor brilliance as the double doors opened. To Thelma, her mind floating on champagne bubbles as she returned from a trip to the powder room, the ballroom's mirrored walls expanded the space into a never-ending cavern of gilt and wood and music, 1,000 dancers stretching far beneath the streets of London. On a raised platform, a 12-piece band played a waltz, their stage framed by a series of painted panels depicting a serene afternoon of Edwardian elegance. What would they say, those staid Edwardians, if they could see the ballroom now, filled with the crowd that David had assembled for Frida Dudley Ward's 39th birthday party? Women barebacked in whispering silk and satin, men in black tuxedos drinking cocktails out of thin-stemmed glasses, swaying in time beneath the chandeliers and cigarette smoke. Thelma paused at the edge of a dance floor, watching a man in an ill-fitting suit stumble to a nearby table to speak to a young woman in a sparkling dress. 10 years ago, he would have been handsome, with his boyish features and crumpled carelessness, but years of overindulgence seemed to have taken their toll, an alcoholic bloat pushing out those of his features that ought to have been small, pouched lips, blue shadows underneath overripe cheeks. He straightened his tie, watching the girl with the devil-may-care smile that, no doubt, had carried him through his youth. The girl rose and took his hand. Together they passed, leaving a beery scent in their wake as they went to dance. Thelma accepted a glass of champagne from a motionless waiter, suppressing a smile. But for the dresses and the music, she figured the Edwardians likely wouldn't have seen anything too far removed from their own gatherings. It had been David's idea to have Frida Dudley Ward's birthday party at the Ritz. He'd been planning the evening for months, personally overseeing the menus and the guest list. As Thelma walked through the crowd, she could see dozens of people that David had invited, as well as a few that hadn't, but who decided to turn up anyway. There by the band was Diana Guinness with Oswald Mosley, her body turned towards his as they spoke in an undertone. Fruity Metcalf, a cigar jammed between his teeth, balanced 3 drinks in his hands as he walked toward the table where Louis Mountbatten, who shared his brother George's long face, sat with Pierce Lee and G. Trotter. Surrounded by men at the bar, Nada, dressed in a chartreuse gown, stood out like punctuation. Thelma returned to her table, hoping to steal a few more minutes' rest before David or anyone else pulled her back on the dance floor and sent her head spinning again. For the moment, though, David was dancing with Freddie. Had they been anyone else, their figures would have been lost in the crowd, but Freddie and David moved like oil through water, separating the tide as they turned in unison. David pulled back to say something to Freddie, smiling tenderly. She looked back with an expression closer to fondness than desire. Wallis Simpson, seated further down the table, shifted into the free chair next to Thelma. "Are you jealous?" she said. Her words melted into each other with delicate precision. Wallis raised an eyebrow, and Thelma could see that she'd had nearly as much to drink as Thelma herself. Thelma rested her chin on her hand, watching as David pulled Freddie close enough for their cheeks to brush. But for her 2 daughters, Frida had come to the Ritz alone. Since divorcing her husband, she hadn't shown any inclination toward marrying again. Not that she would, not to David at least. Though their affair had long since cooled to friendship, Thelma knew that David would respond to any suitors in Freddie's life with jealousy. Any man would have to be content with sharing her. "Not in the slightest," Thelma said as the music shifted into a cheery ragtime. "Really?" said Wallis. She looked at David and Freddie with a hard expression, as though trying to bring them into better focus. "I don't think I could stand it." "I trust him," said Thelma, As David one-stepped with Freddie, his hand low on her waist. Or more to the point, I trust her. Nada excused herself from her crowd of admirers and made her way towards Gloria and George Mountbatten, who were foxtrotting on the dance floor. She tapped her husband on the shoulder, and George, conceding defeat, relinquished his lead. Nada took Gloria by the hand, and they launched into a well-practiced routine. David swung Freddie out with an exaggerated flourish. Their hands broke apart, and she took the momentary distance to shake her head, laughing before walking towards the bar. David shrugged good-naturedly and spun around, eyebrows raised as he caught sight of Thelma and Wallis. Too quick for her, he said once he'd weaved his way over to them, taking out a handkerchief to wipe perspiration from his forehead. Golly, I'm hot. Another round, Thelma? Wallis? The song ended and the band shifted into something more sedate. An Ozzie Nelson number that had come out a few years ago, smooth and sentimentally trite, crooning stars and dreams, but lovely all the same. Rather than retiring from the dance floor, Gloria and Nada moved together and danced on. The slender train of Nada's dress drifted with their movement, brushing itself against Gloria's legs as they swayed, hands clasped, contented. Beside her, Thelma felt Wallis shift closer. Your sister ought to be more discreet, she said, as David relieved a waiter of a tray of drinks. Thelma shrugged. They're only dancing, she said. A private room, a private party, entirely innocent. Private room in a public hotel, Wallis pointed out, and you know how people talk. Thelma frowned, but before she could answer, David, his hand planted on the table to better steady his hand as he lit a cigarette, cleared his throat. I wouldn't think too hard on it, Mrs. Simpson, he said. He inhaled and the cigarette caught the flame. Satisfied, he leaned back with an easy, heavy-lidded smile. It's not really a concern, not to people like us. Let the girls have their dance. They're not harming anybody. After a few minutes, David stubbed out his cigarette with renewed vigor as the opening strains of Blue Danube floated through the room. He held out his hand to Thelma, and she took it, head spinning as he whirled her onto the dance floor. You remember this one? He said, pulling Thelma close. Thelma nodded, glowing in the warmth of his smile. Lady Londonderry's ball. She closed her eyes, trusting in David's sure movements as he led her in the dance. Somewhere nearby, Thelma supposed that Nada and Gloria were still dancing together. She hoped they were. David's words echoed in her head, making her smile at the impossibility of it all. People like us, he'd said. People like us buy out the ballroom at the Ritz. She opened her eyes and looked around. As expected, Gloria and Nada were still dancing nearby, and it was enough to make her throw caution to the wind, lean forward, and press her lips against David's. People like us, she thought triumphantly, own the world and everything in it.
Thank you. Bryn, I really want to thank you for joining the Village Bookshop in Bayfield for this author event. It's the first one we've done. We're really happy to kick these off with you, and we wish you every success with this book and with your next. I hope that you will come back and visit us again, and hopefully when your new book comes out, hopefully we can do it in person.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I so appreciate everybody in Bayfield who's bought my book. Thank you all so very much for supporting this.
Good luck. And to everybody who's attending this evening, thank you so much for supporting your local independent bookshop. We hope you'll continue to do that. We wanted you to know that we have 2 more author events coming up. Both of them are with local authors. In honor of the 40th anniversary of Terry Fox, we'll be talking with Elaine Kugler, the author of The Man Behind the Marathon, and that will be on September 17th at 5 p.m. And we'll be talking with local children's author Joanne Levy, who's joined us here today, on October 22nd. So please make sure that you join us for those events. We're looking forward to them, and we hope to have a lot more of these in the future. So thank you so much, everybody. And now you can go on and have your fun on Friday evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.